The helicopter set down hard on the sand, and the desert swallowed the sound of its rotors before the blades had even stopped spinning. 6 men stepped out first. Then she did. The moment her boots touched the ground, she felt it, not the heat, though the heat was real. A wall of 47-degree air that pressed against the skin like a hand. Not the wind, though that was real too. A slow and suspicious thing that shifted every few minutes with no pattern she could predict yet. What she felt was the pause, the collective breath held, the way the men in front of her stopped walking just long enough to look back, register her, and then look at each other. She had seen that look before. Her name was Emma Hayes, 29 years old, 5'4", 131 pounds with her kit on. Her hair was pulled flat against her skull, the color of dark ash, and her eyes were a gray-green that people sometimes described as cold, and she had stopped correcting them. She did not look like what they expected. She never did. Master Chief Mason Cole was the one who finally spoke. Hayes. He said her name the way you say a thing you're not entirely sure belongs on the list. You're with Reyes on rear security. Keep up. Understood, she said. Nothing more. Nothing less. Marcus Reyes was 26, built like a doorframe, and had the particular type of confidence that comes not from achievement but from never having been seriously tested. He was not unkind, exactly. He simply did not bother to hide what he thought. He glanced at her once as they moved out, took in her kit, her rifle, a custom-configured Accuracy International AXMC 338 Lapua Magnum, and then looked back at the terrain ahead. You ever done a desert op? He asked. Yes, she said. He waited for more. She didn't give him more. The team moved in single file across the first ridge, and Emma settled into position at the rear. She did not try to close the gap between herself and Reyes. She maintained her spacing exactly 15 meters, textbook, and she watched. The sand here was not the pale, postcard kind. It was the color of old brick, reddish-brown, and it absorbed heat rather than reflecting it. The light came down without mercy. No shadows until late afternoon, no cover worth the word. She noted the vegetation. 3 low scrub clusters at the base of the eastern ridge. Nothing tall enough to hide a standing man. Nothing dense enough to hide a prone one. She noted the wind, north-northwest at approximately 12 kilometers per hour. Variable. It had shifted twice since they landed, subtle, but she cataloged it automatically. The kind of shift that matters when your shot has to travel 600 meters. She noted the silence. Real silence, not the absence of sound, but the quality of it. The desert here was not empty. It was waiting. 60 meters ahead, Cole raised a fist. The team stopped. He turned and scanned the ridge to the east. Then, he looked back at her position, and for a moment, Emma thought he was going to say something. Instead, he turned forward again, and the team moved. Quiet back here, Reyes said quietly. Not to her, really. Half to himself, she agreed. She just didn't say so. The mission briefing had been sparse. Reconnaissance of a transit corridor suspected of use by a weapons distribution network. Estimated area of operations, 4 kilometers, roughly square. No confirmed hostile presence in the corridor itself. The intelligence assessment had used the phrase, low probability of contact, which was the kind of phrase that made experienced operators careful and inexperienced ones comfortable. Emma had read the briefing twice. She had also read the weather analysis, the topographic survey, and a 6-month history of reported activity within 10 kilometers of their AO. She had done this on the flight in, quietly, while Reyes and another man named Garrett were telling a story that involved a bar in Virginia Beach and a bet about hot sauce. She had not been invited into that conversation. She had not tried to enter it. At the top of the second ridge, Cole called a short stop. The team gathered 6 men in a loose semicircle, Emma on the outside edge. Cole spread the digital map on a tablet, angled so the glare didn't wash it out, and ran through the waypoint sequence. Overwatch position is here. He touched the map. Elevated ground, 1,200 meters from the objective. We get eyes on, we confirm or deny, we exfil. Clean and simple. What's the window? Garrett asked. He was the team's communication specialist, 31, efficient. 3 hours from insertion, Cole said. We're at 42 minutes now. And Hayes? That was from a man named Briggs, standing directly across the semicircle. His tone was the specific tone of a question that isn't really a question. Cole looked at her. Hayes has rear security until we reach Overwatch, then she holds the low ground while we push to the ridge. Briggs said nothing, but the silence he produced said plenty. Emma held it. She was good at holding silence. She had been holding other people's silence for years in training, in evaluation rooms, in operational briefings where someone would inevitably look at her in that particular way and she would simply wait them out. Not because she was passive, because she was patient, and patience in her experience was worth more than any argument. She could have told Briggs, right there on that ridge, about her qualification scores. She could have mentioned that her 500-meter grouping was tighter than anyone currently on this team. She could have said that she had spent 4 years studying atmospheric ballistics, and that she could calculate a wind-adjusted firing solution in her head faster than most operators could call it in on a radio. She said none of these things. She adjusted her rifle strap, turned her face into the wind for a half-second to register its direction, and waited for Cole to dismiss the group. "Move out," he said. She moved. The route to the overwatch position covered 2 kilometers of moderate-grade terrain, nothing technically difficult, but nothing easy either. The sand was loose on the slopes, and the weight of a full combat load meant every uphill step required a deliberate planting of the foot, a conscious transfer of momentum. Reyes set a pace that was deliberately fast, not tactically fast, testingly fast. Emma matched it. Not easily. Her stride was shorter and her lung capacity, however trained, worked against the math of body size and heat. She felt the burn in her thighs by the end of the first kilometer. She felt her breathing deepen. She did not break form. She did not fall behind. She maintained her 15-meter gap on Reyes with the steadiness of a metronome, and she did it by adjusting her technique rather than increasing her effort. Shorter steps, higher cadence, arms lower and more forward-weighted. It was the kind of adjustment that experience teaches and urgency prevents. The man in front of Reyes was named Holloway. He was the team's medic, quiet by professional habit, and he was the one who first noticed. He said nothing out loud, but Emma saw him glance back twice in the first kilometer, and the second time, he held the look a beat longer. Not with the same flat appraisal Briggs used, with something more like curiosity. At the kilometer mark, Cole called a 30-second water break, while the others drank and redistributed weight. Emma moved to a flat section of rock slightly apart from the group and crouched. She picked up a pinch of sand between 2 fingers, held her arm out at shoulder height, and let it fall. The grains scattered in a line north-northwest drift, but the tail of the scatter kicked east at the last moment. A micro-variation. The kind of thing you only see if you're looking for it. She noted it, filed it, said nothing. What's she doing? That was Briggs, not particularly quiet about it. Holloway watched her. Checking the wind. With sand? It's a technique. It's not a technique I recognize. That doesn't mean it's not a technique, Holloway said, mildly. Briggs made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a dismissal, and finished his water. Cole called the advance. Over the second kilometer, the terrain shifted. The open slope gave way to a broken section of rocky ground where ancient erosion had carved shallow channels through the earth. Good cover for a smaller person, poor ground for a large one. Emma moved through it with the fluency of someone who has spent a long time learning how to use space that doesn't seem to offer any. At one point, the channel narrowed to a slot barely 60 centimeters wide. The men ahead moved through it sideways, shoulders scraping the walls. Emma moved through it straight, rifle angled, and came out on the other side before Reyes had fully cleared the slot. He looked at her when he came through. She looked at the terrain ahead. She's slow, someone had said in the first kilometer. She had heard its sound travels in dry air with uncomfortable clarity, and she had registered it the way she registered everything, filed, contextualized, and set aside. Slow was relative. In a desert environment, slow and steady over 4 kilometers produced better outcomes than fast and degraded at 2. She had studied the post-action reports of 6 operations in comparable terrain. The pattern was consistent. But she was not slow. She was deliberate. The difference mattered in ways that this terrain would eventually demonstrate. At the crest of the final approach to the overwatch position, Cole stopped the team behind a rock shelf and moved forward alone to check the position. He came back 90 seconds later. "Clean," he said. "Reyes, Briggs, Garrett with me to the ridge. Holloway, you hold the forward approach. Hayes, you're on the low ground, south side. You have a radio and you have eyes on the access route. Report anything." She heard the anything as an afterthought. A thing to give her so she'd feel included. "Copy," she said. The men moved toward the ridge. Holloway took up his position on the forward approach. Emma moved south, 40 meters down the slope, until she found what she was looking for. A shallow depression in the rock face, 3 meters wide, that offered a slight elevation advantage over the surrounding ground and a clean sightline in 3 directions. She settled into it. She laid her rifle across the rock lip. She looked at the corridor below the flat, open ground that the intelligence assessment had described as a safe transit route, and she began to read it. The way you read a room when you walk into it for the first time, not looking for anything specific, just absorbing color, shape, texture, negative space. The things that are there and the things that are not. The things that are not. The corridor was wrong. She knew it before she could have articulated why. The feeling preceded the logic, but only by seconds, and then the logic arrived and confirmed it piece by piece. First, the birds. Desert terrain at this elevation and temperature typically hosted 3 or 4 species of ground-adjacent birds, small, heat-adapted, perpetually in motion along the ground cover in search of insects displaced by foot traffic. She had seen them twice in the approach. She saw none now. The absence covered a radius of approximately 400 meters. That was too large an absence for random cause. Something had moved through this ground recently. Something large enough to push every living thing that could relocate away from its natural range. Second, the wind. She had been tracking the wind since the helicopter. She had built a model of it in her head: direction, speed, the pattern of its variations. The corridor below ran roughly east-west, and at this time of day, with this temperature differential between the flat ground and the ridge, the prevailing airflow should have been running through it from the west at a steady 8 to 12 kilometers per hour. It was not. The air in the corridor was still. Unnaturally, specifically still, as if something, a large object or a mass of objects, was blocking the western approach and redirecting the airflow around rather than through. That meant something was positioned at the western mouth of the corridor that did not appear on any intelligence assessment she had read. Third, the light. At this angle, with the sun at its current position, the eastern end of the corridor should have shown a consistent gradient of shadow along the southern wall, a slow, even darkening as the rock face caught less direct sun. Instead, there were 3 points along that wall where the shadow was slightly deeper, slightly more interrupted than the surrounding surface. Not significantly, not obviously, barely enough to register. She registered it. She adjusted her scope, brought the magnification up, held her breath and let her eyes work. There, a rifle barrel, half behind a rock formation at the eastern end of the southern wall. The angle was wrong for a natural piece of debris. Metal held light differently than stone. Even in shade, the differential was readable if you knew what you were looking for. 1. She moved her scope slowly, deliberately, 12 meters east along the wall. There. A second position. Better concealed. This one had taken time, had arranged the surrounding debris with care. But the care itself was evidence. Natural rock formations do not exhibit that kind of symmetry. Full. She swept wider, up to the ridge above the eastern end of the corridor, and held for a long moment. 3. The third was the best of them. Elevated, excellent angle on the corridor below, and on the approach route the team had used. Someone had walked that approach route recently and had identified it as the most probable line of ingress. The third position covered it completely. Emma took one full breath. Then she pressed her radio. Cole, Hayes. I have eyes on potential hostile positions in the corridor. 3. Repeat. 3. South wall and eastern ridge. Do not advance. Static. Then Cole's voice, quiet and controlled, but with the specific flatness that indicated skepticism. Hayes, confirm. You have positive identification? I have visual indicators consistent with concealed shooter positions. No positive ID on personnel. But the pattern is, hold position. We're pushing to visual on the objective. She stopped. She looked at the corridor below. She pressed the radio again. Cole, the wind pattern in the corridor is wrong. Something is blocking the western approach, and there are no birds in a 400-meter radius. A pause. Stay in position, Hayes. She lowered the radio. She looked at the scope. She looked at the position at the eastern ridge, the third one, the one with the angle on the team's approach, and she watched. Something's off. She had said it. She had provided the reasoning. She had used the radio correctly, said the right words in the right sequence, and offered the evidence she had. He had heard her and moved forward anyway. She understood why. Not because it was right, but because she understood the architecture of it, the way that a warning from an untested source, delivered without the authority of rank or established credibility, gets processed differently than the same warning from a familiar voice. Cole had years of operational experience and a team he trusted. She had been on the ground with him for 93 minutes. The math of credibility was not in her favor. Understanding it did not make it less dangerous. She lay in her depression in the rock face and watched the approach route, and she thought about the variables. The team was moving toward the ridge. They would reach it in approximately 6 minutes. She had paced the terrain on the way up and could extrapolate the descent. When they crested the ridge and began moving down toward the corridor, the third shooter position would have a clean angle on the entire leading element. 6 minutes. She looked at her options. She could continue on the radio. Cole had told her to hold position, which meant a second transmission would be insubordinate and would likely be ignored. She could move, physically relocate to a position that changed the tactical geometry, but that would take time and create noise and compromise rear security, and she did not yet have a confirmed shot angle on any of the 3 positions. Or she could wait. Waiting was not passive in this case. Waiting was information gathering. Every additional second of observation refined her model of the positions, their angles, their fields of fire, their likely communication protocol. She watched the third position for 90 seconds without blinking. The shooter was there. She could see the barrel now, not the tip of it, the first 2 inches emerging from behind the rock formation at an angle that suggested the shooter was prone, fully settled, their eye already at the scope. They were watching the approach route. Cole's team would come over that ridge in approximately 4.5 minutes. Emma made a decision. She came up from the depression. Not standing, she moved in a low, controlled sweep north and east along the rock face, using the terrain the way she had learned to use it, not fighting the ground but reading it, finding the path that offered both cover and the angle she needed. She moved without rushing because rushing in this terrain produced sound, and sound in this kind of silence carried the way voices carry in a cathedral. 40 meters. 60. She found a second depression, shallower than the first but oriented correctly. She could see the third position at the eastern ridge, and if she angled her rifle 17 degrees left of her current bearing, she would have a clear firing line on the first position along the southern wall as well. The second position, the better concealed one in the center, was in dead ground. She couldn't take it from here. She noted that. She would have to work the sequence. She settled into the rock, checked her sight picture. When she recalculated, because she had moved and the terrain between her and the targets had changed and the calculation had to change with it, the air here moved in a slow curl off the ridge face, adding a 1 to 2 degree right drift at distance. The third position was 640 meters away. She estimated it at 630 because the rock formation introduced parallax error at this magnification. She breathed out. She looked at the ridge crest. Cole's team was going to appear on that crest in approximately 3 minutes. 3 minutes and 40 seconds before Cole's team crested the ridge, the third shooter shifted position. It was a small movement, a repositioning of the shoulders, a slight elevation of the barrel, but it changed the angle from monitoring to engagement. The shooter was settling into a firing solution, not a preliminary one. A final one. They had heard the radio transmissions. Emma recalculated instantly. The timeline had collapsed. The team was not 3 minutes away from the kill zone. They were about to walk into it. She pressed the radio one last time. Cole, they've gone active. Do not crest the ridge. Stop now. She did not wait for acknowledgement. She turned to her scope and settled. The third position was the priority. It had the angle on the team, but if she fired on it now, she would alert positions 1 and 2, and without a clear shot on either of those, she would be trading a certain kill for 2 active shooters who now knew they were being engaged. She needed a different solution. She thought about it for approximately 4 seconds. The rock formation behind which shooter 3 was concealed had a specific quality. It was not a single piece of stone, but a cluster of 3 large fragments resting against each other, which meant there was a gap between fragments 1 and 2 at roughly chest height, not large enough to see from the corridor, large enough, at this angle, to admit a bullet. If she shot through the gap and the bullet struck fragment 2, it would create a percussion that would displace shooter 3 from their position, not necessarily kill, but force movement. And movement, in this context, was exposure. She ran the ballistic calculation. 630 meters. Wind drift, 1 degree right at range. Temperature correction, positive adjustment for air density at this heat. The gap between the rock fragments was approximately 20 centimeters wide. The margin of error at this distance, with this ammunition, in a 10-kilometer crosswind with a variable curl, was 6 to 8 centimeters. She had, in training, put 3 consecutive shots through an 18-centimeter gap at 700 meters. This was closer. The gap was wider. She exhaled. 2 minutes until Cole's team reached the ridge. She found her position, not just her physical position in the rock, but the internal one. The stillness that has nothing to do with the body and everything to do with the mind, the place where calculation ends and execution begins, and they are the same thing. She moved the scope to position 1 on the southern wall. If she shot 3 first and drove them from positions 1 and 2 would know she was here. But if she fired on position 1 first, a clean, direct shot, and then moved immediately to 3, she could take 1 and 2 in rapid succession before 3 had time to do more than identify her general location. The problem was position 2. She couldn't see it from here. After taking 1 and 3, she would have an active shooter in the center of the corridor who knew she existed. She thought about the terrain. Position 2 was well concealed, but the concealment required a specific orientation. The shooter had to be facing west to maintain coverage of the approach route while staying hidden from direct southern observation. That meant their peripheral awareness to the north was limited, and the rock formation she was currently using as cover extended north at a 40-degree angle that, if she advanced 25 meters along it, would give her a sight line on position 2 from a direction the shooter had not prepared for. But she could not advance 25 meters and still fire on positions 1 and 3. She had to choose, take the certain shots from here, or advance and take all 3. 1 minute, 30 seconds. She chose here. She settled on position 1. The desert held its breath. She didn't. She breathed steady, deliberate, in through the nose, a slow controlled release, through slightly parted lips, not the held breath of movies and television, where the hero freezes entirely and time stops around them. Real precision shooting breathes. You align the shot with the respiratory pause at the bottom of the exhale the moment before the next breath begins, when the body is at rest and the crosshairs are at their stillest. She found it. She took position 1. The shot was clean, a single report that the desert absorbed almost immediately, the way it absorbs everything. Immediate. Complete. Position 1 was no longer a factor. She worked the bolt. She moved to position 3. Position 3 had registered the shot. The barrel was withdrawing behind the rock formation. But the movement itself created the exposure she needed. The gap between fragments 1 and 2 was now occupied differently as the shooter shifted, and that shift had opened a better line than the one she had originally calculated. She took it. Position 3. The bolt again. Silence. In the silence, she heard something she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting for it. A sound from position 2. A scrape of boot on rock. The minute, involuntary flinch of a human being who has just heard 2 shots and is recalibrating their assessment of the situation. The scrape came from the north side of the concealment position. They were moving. They were moving north, which meant they were moving toward better cover and also toward the angle she had identified 25 meters up the rock face. She had not been able to advance and take position 2 from the north, but position 2 was now advancing into her sight line from the north. She waited 12 seconds. The top of a head appeared at the edge of the concealment position. A shoulder. Then, as the shooter pushed further north, trying to read the terrain they now understood had a hostile element in it, the profile cleared. She was already settled. The third shot closed the operation. She worked the bolt. She waited. The corridor below was completely still. No additional movement. No further indicators. 3 positions, neutralized in approximately 45 seconds from first trigger pull. She pressed the radio. Cole. 3 hostile positions, south wall and eastern ridge, all neutralized. Corridor is. She paused. Looked again. Held for 10 full seconds. Corridor is clear. You can move. A long silence on the radio. Then, say again, Hayes. She said it again. No one said anything for a long time. Not on the radio. Not when Cole's team came back over the ridge and down the slope to where she was still in position, rifle across the rock lip, eyes on the corridor below. They moved to her location in single file and she heard them before she saw them. And when they came around the rock face and found her lying prone in the shallow depression, there was a pause that had a different quality than all the other pauses of the day. This one was not skepticism. She stood up slowly, rolled her shoulders, and looked at Cole. He was looking at the corridor, at the 3 positions, the stillness of them, the specific kind of stillness that has only one meaning. Then he looked at her, then at the distance between her position and the nearest target. She had not moved from approximately this location to fire on positions 1 and 2. Position 3 required the adjustment. She had made 25 meters of elevation for the sight line, but positions 1 and 2 were taken from within 40 meters of where she now stood. 630 meters to position 3. Cole did the math. She watched him do it. She watched the moment it resolved. Holloway came up beside him and did the same thing. He looked at the distances, looked at her rifle, looked at her, and whatever question he had been forming since the first kilometer since he had watched her crouching at the rock with a pinch of sand between her fingers found its answer. Reyes was the one who spoke first. He said, "How did you?" She looked at him. He stopped. She waited a beat, and then she said, simply, "Wind shifted." 2 words. Not a boast, not an explanation, not an invitation to ask more, just the fact of it, delivered in the same tone she would use to report a weather observation, because that is what it essentially was. She had read the wind. She had read the terrain. She had read the absence of birds and the stillness in the corridor and the shadow on the eastern wall, and she had put the information together and acted on it. That was the sum of it. Briggs stood at the edge of the group, and she did not look at him directly, but she was aware of him in the way you are always aware of the person whose opinion of you has been most explicit. She was aware of him standing there in the specific silence of a man who has nothing to say because everything he might say would cost him something. She turned back to the corridor. "We should confirm the positions before we move through," she said to Cole. "Standard sweep. I can provide overwatch from the eastern ridge once the south wall is cleared." Cole looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Reyes, Garrett south wall. Holloway eastern ridge with Hayes. Not. You stay here. Not. We'll handle it." Not the language of a person being managed out of the way. He gave her a position. A real one. She moved to it. The debrief happened at the forward operating base. In a room that smelled of coffee and recycled air, and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes after a day in which something has gone differently than it was supposed to. Cole sat across from the mission coordinator, a man named Whitfield, compact and precise, who had a habit of reading documents while people were talking to him and somehow managing to convey complete attention to both simultaneously. He did not look up from his tablet when Cole came in. "Casualty report," Whitfield said. "0 friendly," Cole said. Now Whitfield looked up. Cole told him. The ambush, the 3 positions, the radio transmissions, the shots. He told it in the clipped, sequential way that operational reporting demands: fact, 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 result, result, result. And at the end, Whitfield set his tablet down and folded his hands on the table and said, "Hayes?" "Yes." Whitfield reached for a different document. He moved it across the table to Cole without explanation. Cole looked at it. It was Emma Hayes's full service record, not the condensed briefing version, which listed her role and assignment and relevant training. The full record. Cole had not requested it. He had not, until approximately 6 hours ago, felt any particular urgency to read it. He read it now. Qualified expert. Rifle. 99th percentile scoring in force. Wide evaluation. Atmospheric ballistics certification. Advanced level. Fort Bragg. Sniper school. Completed with distinction. Class rank. First. There was a note in the record about the completion of sniper school, a brief, bureaucratic entry that explained why, despite graduating first in her class, she had not been placed in a sniper billet. The note cited a cultural fit assessment, which was the kind of phrase that meant different things depending on who was reading it. Cole read it and understood what it meant. She had been too independent. She did not defer to established protocol in ways that made her supervisors comfortable. During a training exercise, she had deviated from the assigned firing solution and used her own calculated approach, which had produced a better result. But the fact of the deviation was what had been recorded, not the result. She had been filed under a category that essentially meant correct but unmanageable. Cole set the document down. He thought about the morning. He thought about the way she had pressed the radio twice with specific, actionable intelligence that he had declined to act on. He thought about the 2 words she had said when Reyes asked how she had done it. Wind shifted. Not, I told you something was wrong. Not, you should have listened. Not any of the things that would have been understandable, given the circumstances. Just the technical fact, the precise answer to the precise question. Whitfield was watching him. She called it on the radio, Cole said. Twice. I know, Whitfield said, and I told her to hold position. I know that too. Cole said nothing for a moment. Then he said, she graduated sniper school first in her class and she's on rear security for a reconnaissance patrol. Yes, Whitfield said. That's Cole stopped. Started again. That's a significant misallocation. Whitfield's expression did not change. Write that in your after-action report, he said. In those exact words, Cole picked up the document again. Read the cultural fit assessment again. Set it back down. She didn't argue with me, he said. When I told her to hold, she pressed the radio twice, and when I declined, she didn't argue. She just repositioned and managed the situation. What do you consider that? Cole thought about it. Discipline, he said. Then, and judgment. Yes, Whitfield said. That's generally what it is. Emma was not present for the debrief. She was in a smaller room down the corridor, writing her own after-action report on a government-issue laptop that had a keyboard with a slightly sticky H key, and she was being precise and complete in the way she was always precise and complete sequence of events, decision rationale, firing solutions employed, results. She included the radio transmissions with their times and their content. She included her own decision to reposition without authorization. She noted that this decision had been made on her assessment that the tactical situation had evolved beyond the parameters of her original orders and that waiting for updated orders would have resulted in team exposure to confirmed hostile fire. She included this not defensively, but because it was accurate, and accuracy was the point of the document. When she finished, she read it back once, made 2 minor corrections, and sent it. Then she sat in the small room and drank a cup of coffee that had gone cold and thought about nothing in particular. She was very good at this at the space between events. Some people couldn't tolerate it. They filled it with noise or motion or conversation. She found that the space between events was where she did some of her clearest thinking, not because she was actively thinking, but because she had learned not to resist the stillness. A knock at the door. Holloway. He came in with 2 fresh coffees and set one in